Hey, welcome to another exciting episode of In the Chute. Today we have,
Braden? Oh, I thought you were going to introduce me.
Braden and, of course, Calen, but hopefully I just have to sit here and listen today. Maybe not. Calen, what do you got?
Okay, the question is for Braden, who's supposed to be a subject matter expert in rangeland management.
I wouldn't say expert.
Well, we're going to consider you that for today's
Okay. Well, I've
discussion.
watched a couple of movies, so I think I can.
Which
Okay.
movie
keep
did
up
you
with
watch last by wanting to wear the glasses?
Top Gun.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
No,
So the question is going to be
Oh, you're
weeds.
not going to let me
How?
go on a monologue? Okay, go ahead.
No,
Go
you're
ahead.
not
I'll,
getting monologue.
I'll let you do your sciencey stuff.
Weeds for the ranch. When they arrive, how do you identify them? What are they? What is some indicators for weed arrival? And then what do you normally plan for in order to ensure that we expedite their departure by killing them or mitigating them entirely if that's possible? So what are some of your processes, identification, so on and so forth?
Okay, first of all, that was a lot of questions, so we might have to
He
address them
he
individually.
does that.
No.
Are you talking about things that we do here or things that we can practice
Yes.
potentially or
Everything.
Let's start with what do we do on the ranch, and then what are some potentials that you can also do outside of the ranch?
I think Dad can answer the stuff that we do on the ranch best, but I mean, all we've ever really done is like herbicide stuff, haven't we?
Yeah,
Because we've sprayed for the broom snakeweed and
right. And Dalmatian toad flax, those are things that are like the toad flax,
Yeah.
those are noxious weeds. And I mean, you have a legal obligation to try to contain those. So, we do that with as herbicide as good as we can, hit them hard, and hopefully they go away. And we've been very successful with the toad flax in that manner.
Well, and the thing is, you want to hit it before it even starts to get a foothold, especially with like the toad flax. Because look at cheatgrass, it gets a little bit of a foothold and then it just takes over, especially with any kind of disturbance like overgrazing. Fire is actually really beneficial for the cheatgrass. People don't know that. They think burning it's going to help, but it actually helps spread cheatgrass because all you do is you burn back any of the perennials and other stuff. And then if it's the right time of the year, those annuals can take over. Just like along roadsides, any kind of disturbance, you see a lot of weeds, especially along roadsides. And that's where you'll get a lot of the knapweeds and all that stuff because it is disturbed. So all of the native plants can't get established and those annual invasives come in and then they just take over.
So
So
what are some of
minimizing
your ways?
disturbances, if that's one of your questions, is a good way of mitigating.
Sure. So what's some of your like go-to? Is there like a go-to herbicide that you normally identify and use that would attack a lot of the stuff that you're talking about?
They're usually pretty specific. Like with the broom snakeweed, that was a broad-leafed forb. Was that how it was classified?
Yeah, and it took escort
Mm-hmm.
and some E2. The escort was the big thing, but the issue is about, and maybe you can expand on this, is herbicide resistance in plants.
Mm.
And you see a lot of that in some of the plants that you're trying to stop, say like kochia
Yeah.
or Russian thistle. I mean, that stuff is horrible, and you can spray it, but if you don't eradicate it, it begins to, especially over time, get a lot of resistance, and then they're always working on new things. So
Mm-hmm.
it's important to wipe them out, get a really good kill on them instead of a haphazard one, or not mix it well, not mix it correctly so that it doesn't get a
Right.
kill.
You know, I don't know too much about herbicides to be honest, because we never really went over that in school. And I haven't really kept up on any of those kinds of things ever since I graduated 3 years ago. So I'm a little bit out of practice, but
So
But your
okay,
grasses are there.
yeah.
here's a good question then. So we'll say you're out of practice because you haven't been in school for a couple of years. If you were to really start jumping back into it and trying to identify things and attack things and really like throw all your effort into it, where are some places that you go to identify things and grab or obtain the correct herbicides? Like what are some like glossary or indexes that you would go to?
Extension agents are a huge positive, or I guess they're a great tool to utilize. Because a lot of people will, especially in our area, like MSU throws out a bunch of good stuff. I honestly have friends that I graduated with that all went into NRCS, BLM, Forest Service, and they'd be great people to at least, like, if I don't know where to get started, I could talk to them and they could just send me down a certain path. But I could always reach out to my professors at school. They're always super willing to, I mean, just nerd out about grasses with their students, and they're super helpful and they want to educate people on that kind of stuff. So, um, again, even not just them, but they can provide you with materials of where to go with that kind of stuff. But a lot of
So
times, honestly, those extension agents are best with all the herbicides because they're a lot of times for that specific area or that county. So
if you don't know people like you, so you're saying like maybe contact the extension agents or even call like a university like Montana State and look at the directory to ask if you could get in contact with somebody in like the agriculture college or something like that.
yeah,
Well,
Yeah.
and one of the things that I've, along that line, I've been to some of these extension agents, outreach programs and some educational things to go to. And guess who they have as their speakers? A lot of them are professors from
school,
the school, from MSU, or they have a combined effort to use not just the extension agency, but also the colleges themselves, and they have a lot of students that do research along with them, and that's how they find out what the resistance is on things, what the best use is, all of the pertinence that you would want to do. So those the professors are right in there hand in hand with the extension agencies,
yeah,
and the students themselves.
When it comes to eradicating weeds, what are some of the go-tos, not just for actually the weeds, but like the context of the situation in terms of a livestock herd, animals, kids, the environment? What are some things that you look at before you go to apply herbicide?
honestly, the best thing you can do is the natural stuff because kids and animals or puppies, cats, whatever, they like to
Yeah.
get into things. So if you got some of those herbicides laying around, that can be potentially bad. Especially, I know you talked about when you were getting your license for poisoning prairie dogs.
Right.
There was that story about that dude that had been applying this chemical. I don't know, do you remember what chemical it
Yeah,
was?
it was the aluminum phosphide
Okay.
that produces, essentially, it's cyanide gas
Yeah.
when it gets wet, and I think it's cyanide. Anyway, applied it around the house, and kids slept in the basement, and that gas seeped down into the basement and killed 4 kids.
Oof.
Yeah.
So with herbicides, it's not, I don't think they're ideal. A lot of people like to go straight to them because they're convenient, they're easy. People are lazy a lot of times. That's not always the case with herbicides. I'm just saying, sometimes we don't have time to do other stuff, so or can't afford to do something other than just grab a bottle of Roundup or whatever. But I think that a lot of times people overlook simple things of like different grazing practices or even changing up the animals that you've got in there because different animals will eat different stuff. Like if you throw horses out there, they tend to be selective grazers, so they'll go find the best forage that's out on the ground and then they will find that little area and they will eat that down very, very, very short, and then they'll leave the stuff around it because it's not as palatable, and then they'll go off over this direction and they'll do the same thing here. Whereas cows, they'll just kind of eat a lot of stuff. Obviously, the palatability comes into it, so maybe the stuff that's freshly growing, but a lot of times they'll stick to the grasses. And then you talk about like sheep and goats that just eat everything, but they'll eat some of the more they won't just graze, they'll browse too. They'll get the leafy stuff, they'll eat buds on
Leafy
trees.
spurge is a good one with goats, right? And sheep.
Trying
to control that.
I've heard that, and I mean, I've seen studies about it, but I've also had some friends in college that are sheep farmers, and they're like, I've never seen that. So I don't know, but
Okay.
I mean, that's definitely things you can try out. Is just different practices with your grazing and management of your livestock, or increasing or decreasing your numbers.
It almost sounds like a more agricultural, holistic approach to weed eradication rather than just chemical.
Oh yeah. Well, and then you look at what we've done historically with chemicals too. Tordon was a huge thing. You got to look at ecology as a very young science because it is. It's only been around like 100 years. And so basically, everything that we know now has been making these mistakes over the past 100 years. And one of those was Tordon. We thought Tordon was great because it just killed things like done. However, it also seeped into the soil bed and then it would kill everything else around it. I think there was one study that was in like Wyoming where they were trying to get rid of, I think, Russian olive or something. I think a Russian olive, but there was a bunch of cottonwoods in the area too along this river, this stream, and it killed all the cottonwoods, all the Russian olive, all the native grass. I think it even killed a lot of the fish in the system. And then so after that, they've gone away from Tordon and they're like, don't use Tordon at all. And then now there's some chemicals that actually have a trace amount of Tordon in it because it is effective, but in a small dose. I don't know. So I'm just hesitant with chemicals because so much can go wrong. Kids can die, animals can die. It's just, and you don't want to be spraying your crops with this nasty stuff that your beef cattle are going to consume. And then how does that affect, that's just a whole rabbit hole that I don't have the answers for, but it just raises some questions in my mind.
One of the first things I think about is what could carry it? If you put it on the ground, what could carry it? You get some rain and it seeps down and you're close to a riparian area or even a spring. Now you've contaminated water source, just exactly like you're talking about. And get into groundwater. I use some of that stuff for like morning glory. A bindweed is kind of just a pain in the butt. It's a broadleaf. You can be pretty effective with it, but it's like around buildings, right around here in the yard. And so I spray it, but I also am pretty selective about where it goes too. I'm not coming close to the house with it. I'm close to the wells, with the spray, and trying to get rid of that and stay on top of it. That's the other thing is, whatever you do, like the holistic approach with different species, or sometimes they even will turn aphids loose, on different things, on say some kind of like cutworms, things like that. And there's a myriad of things that are out there that can affect crops, but you always have to look at it, to me, as long term. You're doing something, you got to continue to do it. So what's the least invasive, the least problematic for a long-term use too? I think we're really seeing the same thing about those issues and where and how much. And I know guys that you ask them how much Roundup or something that they would put into a tank and go, oh, tip the jug and do about 3 good glugs. That's not a measurement.
That's also how grandma cooks, though. She's
there you go.
A little bit of this.
That's right.
I can't reproduce that.
Exactly. So, I think we misuse it. And I think that's also part of why that we have resistance issues sometimes.
Yeah, I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that chemicals are bad. Don't do it. And the people that do are idiots. That's not true at all. I'm just saying I have my reservations on it, and I would prefer to go more of a natural route, and maybe it is appropriate.
But... Well, and I think to your point, kind of like what we've said over the past in this channel for the last couple of years is, the repercussions of, antibiotics and stuff with cattle. You're also talking the same thing with weeds, what can happen into your own food supply, and to Dad's point, the water supply. So those are two very important things. You're not only looking at the ground and the animals, but you're also looking selfishly as well, which is, I think, to an extent, a good thing.
Well, it's like your example in Wyoming. How long does it take to flush that entire system out?
It took a long time. I think it took like 40 or 50 years or something before things started to come back. And then you got to remember, it's been completely wiped and sterilized. So the first things that are come back are going to be invasives or annuals that are not supposed to be there. And then over time, it's going to slowly, you'll have those native perennials, native annuals come in and
choke them out,
start to take back over. And that's another thing with the herbicide too, is you might be killing this plant and it may not affect your natives, but are there other invasives around the area that can more easily outcompete your native species? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if you got your native, you got your native species here, an invasive here, and then there's a third invasive over here. You kill this one, but then does this annual and this native, or excuse me, this invasive and this native, which one's going to outcompete? So you might be killing an annual invasive plant, but then you might just have another one backfill it instead of letting your annual or your perennials, your natives take over.
Well, some of
That was
these,
a horrible way of explaining. I'm sorry.
no, it sounds to me like what you're saying is that you may have two invasive species that kind of are keeping each other in check from the native, but you take one of those out, now it outcompetes the native.
Right.
Right,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's
So that's
me.
also why it's important to know what you've got and know what's around. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Oh,
We're
and
gonna-
read your labels.
Yeah.
We're gonna wrap it up with all of that. There's a whole lot in that episode, but that's weeds and identification, eradication, and the various processes and the reasonings behind it. So with that, we'll take that conversation and put it out to pasture.